We're on session 9, and the topic today is feast or famine. We're going to harvest the business, and in this case, we're going to sell it or go IPO. This is a familiar chart, and it just looks at all the stages we've walked through as we went up the stairs, and we're now at the very bottom. So you'll have a choice either at the rapid growth phase or when you've hit some level of maturity to look at an exit, and the timing is based on a number of factors. The rate of growth that you think you can continue without additional funding, the entry of competition into your business, or the IPO market conditions. So there are many considerations within your own company, its industry, or the general securities market. We're going to have 6 learning objectives. First is when we plan the exit strategy. Second is a method called systematic liquidation. Doesn't sound good, and frankly, it's not quite as good as what we hoped for when we started the entity. Third is an outright sale to an outside buyer. The fourth is a leveraged buyout and a variation called a MBO or a management buyout. Fifth is the IPO. And sixth is what is the role of investment banking, a little bit about the process on how an IPO and pricing occurs. All right, learning objective 1, planning your exit. So evidence is that over half of the entrepreneurs either have a formal exit strategy or have thought about it at the outset. It's part of the dream. It's saying, okay, if we're able to do X, Y, and Z and have accomplished this kind of business and customer validation, what might this be worth? And that dream will carry a lot of dismal days along the journey. And once you have it in place, then you'll look for windows of opportunity. I think a better way to think about it is every single time you're approaching the need for money, and that happens throughout the life of the growth venture, think, is this the time to sell? And the reason that's a worthwhile question is you're about to embark on quite a journey to raise money and make pitches and burn a lot of money and time. You want to know that raising money from yet another capital source is superior to just selling at that point in time. And of course, early stage, you won't have that choice, so don't spend a lot of time on it. But as you move forward, as you've established a product, there are suitors along the way that are either competitors who want to take on your product or to keep your product out of the market against them, or an entrant who wants to enter a new business and wants to buy your business as their quick start into a program. So there are various alternatives that will be available earlier than you might think, basically after you've established the superiority of your solution and the commercial appetite for your solution. Valuation of a company, we've seen this before, where we look at the entry of a new capital source and determine how much money they need. In this example, on the left side, we have the future enterprise value of $15 million, and who gets what. In this case, we've determined that the rate of return and the time frame necessary for the VC requires that they get $7.6 million out of the successful exit, and because of that, that constitutes a certain percentage. And in this case, that percentage is about 50% of the total. And in terms of the equity piece, when we subtract out the bank debt, they will own 76%. So they get roughly half of the total proceeds, but after you take care of the bank, they'll receive 76% of what's left for the equity holders. Their rate of return, as we've seen before, was determined early on prior to the pricing of the security to begin with at some rate of return and a time frame. The bottom asterisk shows that in this case, the invested amount was $2.5 million. The holding period was 5 years. The rate of return was 25%, so that constituted a requirement or a target of $7.6 million by year 5, which is the point of exit. Harvesting is a word that is the endpoint. It's the fruit of your labor, and the farming analogy is apropos here. You have to prepare the soil, you have to plant the seeds, you have to fertilize and water, you have to tend it over the growth season, and then at the end of the season, you're able to harvest and then reap the rewards of your work. Well, that's the same as an IPO or a M&A transaction. You've worked hard to build your company, and now it's time to reap rewards. So the alternatives we're going to look at are systematic liquidation, outright sale, and IPO. So systematic liquidation, as the name implies, is that we're going to use the cash flows and we're going to start distributing the money. And this can be done for a longer period of time because you may have achieved a business that will have a few years to go as far as generating good cash flow, and you can use that for distribution. So rather than continuing to invest money and pouring all your profit back into the business, you might find that it's good to just sit and run the business and generate cash and distribute the cash. So the advantage is that you have control. The advantage is it will be spread over years. And the other advantage, you don't have to find a buyer. And that buyer may have some high discount rate and give you a low dollar amount. You may be better off just running the business until it goes away. The disadvantage is that the liquidation proceeds, if you do it through this systematic way, will be seen as just profit, and you'll be taxed at the corporate level as ordinary income. And then when you distribute the money, it'll be taxed again as dividend. And it might be not as exciting for the entrepreneur and even the managers and employees. They may not want to just sit around and slowly liquidate the company. They may be missing the action and want to go to another startup and do it all over again. And the value may not be as much as what you think. So at some point, maybe the cash flow drops off precipitously, or when you do try to sell, your market is gone. So there are considerations that would argue against the systematic liquidation. And I don't want to prejudge whether it's good or bad for a particular venture, but it is one of the alternatives you should look at, because often we will find that someone buying the company, unless there's a very active competition to buy your company, you may be given a very low price, and you might be better off just holding on to it or for a few years, and you get more than what you were being offered. So it's something to look at. Another choice is outright sale. And this is where we could sell to, I guess, any good buyer. It could be a family member if it's a closely held company, or it could be the managers. They may want to band together, buy the company, and run it for their own. It could be to employees, and we'll talk a little bit about employee stock option plans that allow companies to have ownership of the company. Or it could be, of course, to an outside buyer. First, if we use an outright sale, it could be to outsiders or it could be insiders. If it's an outsider, there are firms that, again, are private equity with lowercase p and lowercase e that are formed to be LBO funds, where they buy companies and they use leveraged capital sources for themselves, buy companies, turn them around or pretty them up, or themselves liquidate it in order to get yield from their investment. Or it could be management buyout. This is a scenario where management wants to buy the company, but they don't have the cash. They just have the desire to run and run well the business, but they don't have the money. So in this case, the terms are different because hopefully there's low risk, and there are firms that specialize in providing MBO or management buyout funding. An example of this is something I did with one of my entities, Norris, Pecks, and Simpson. This was a company that I referred to along the way, many of it related to pain, but along the way we had a lot of fun and some good times as well. But MB&S was formed in 1932 out of the Great Depression, and it was a high integrity and respected firm, and they did mostly institutional client work for life insurance companies and large local players. And it grew too quickly, and it was exposed in a real estate recession that occurred in the late 1980s. So I was the CFO and general partner through this growth period and, unfortunately, for the decline period. And I was a general partner, which led to very painful risk for my personal assets. And I spent 3 years to wind it down gracefully while protecting my partner's personal assets. And so we were all general partners, and I was lucky enough to be the one working with the senior people to find a way out for the company. So one of the things we did, among many, is to spin off the piece of the company that was working, that was profitable, that did not overextend, and that was the Northwest. We had offices in Portland, Oregon, Bellevue, Washington, was just outside of Seattle, and Vancouver, not Vancouver, Canada, but Vancouver, Washington, which is a suburb of Portland. It's on the other side of the river, therefore it's in the state of Washington. And there were 3 of our 10 partners that were working that area. So we worked out a deal with those 3 partners and others to buy themselves free from the mothership, which was sinking, so they could continue the company. So this graphic here depicts what happened. So the middle is the NBNS Northwest, which is this group of 3 partners plus some new ones that would join them. They went to a management buyout firm and they got money and they signed a loan to the MBO firm. Then they took that money and bought their freedom from the mothership of Norris, Pecks, and Simpson, and they got all the Northwest operations and the use of the name. So they got exclusive use of the name Norris, Pecks, and Simpson, which again had dated back to 1932 throughout the western United States. So they own the name and we could no longer use that in California. So we use the proceeds and the mothership to use it to settle and negotiate payment for our creditors to somehow whittle down the amount of overhang that we had as partners. MBNS Northwest got their freedom, so to speak, and they ran their business and well over all these years. They've been separate now for 20 plus years, and they were able to pay off the loan, and they actually paid it off ahead of maturity schedule for the loan because they really were diligent, ran the business well, and have succeeded. The other approach that we looked at is what is an employee stock ownership plan, or an ESOP. So in kind of graphical form, again, on the left we have a non-leveraged ESOP where there is ESOP trust, which is the entity that's formed to hold the interest of the employees. And then they have a company that would then sell to the trust, and the trust in turn distributes money to its employees. So that's a simple non-leveraged ESOP. The one on the right, which is frankly more typical, is that it's a leverage ESOP because it's unlikely that the employees could have enough money to buy themselves free. Similar to the MBO example, you need a financing partner. So here, the ESOP trust creates a purchase from the company. In this case, it is the fund co. And then they get money, use that money to buy the stock. And then now the trust owns the stock but has debt. And then as money comes over the years from the underlying company, the entity that you bought, use that money to pay off the loan, and the leftover money will then belong to the employees. So that's a leveraged ESOP. And so this is a general seen as a positive thing in the U.S. economy, that employees would have the ability to own their own company, control their own destiny, and share in the value created. So there's quite a bit of political and financial backing for ESOPs, and there are tax advantages. So banks that perform this intermediate function and provide funding for ESOPs receive some tax advantages. So ESOP is not a huge thing in the U.S., but it is significant, and it's been around for many years, and you can see the allure of this to a public policymaker. An example, there's a national organization called the NCEO, or the National Center for Employee Ownership, that helps advise companies and employees on how to do this and how there are proven examples of why this has worked well. This is an article from about a year ago showing that the largest employee-owned companies are not small names. They're big companies and they're successful ones, largest being Publix. And the next slide shows that here's the top 10, and they're large employment bases. So the supermarket chain, which is Publix, has 188,000. Penmark, which is a staffing agency, has 24,000. So these are not little businesses. They're pretty significantly sized businesses. And these are all ESOP structured investments. Another example that was number 24 on that list, so we didn't see the entire list, was Gensler. Gensler is interesting because it's right down the block from us. Their headquarters are on California and Kearney, and it's one of the world's largest, if not the largest, architectural firm. And this is the Shanghai Tower that they're in charge of, will be one of the largest, if not the largest, building in the world. They employ about 5,000 people, mostly professionals, architectural professionals, and was founded by a gentleman named Art Gensler. And Art was an excellent architect and a very decent person, and he built a firm. But they kind of hit a wall because many of the stronger architects would leave the firm and start their own. That happens in all professional service businesses. So they were a McKinsey client in the 80s, and they developed a program or an approach called the studio system, where essentially you have the company of Gensler, and he had studios comprised of smaller groups of architects with a varying amount of seniority. And the most senior person in that studio would run it like a little business. So Gensler became a series of little businesses operating under a powerful umbrella. So that went pretty well. And then in 1987, they went the final step of creating the ownership of the Gensler Associates in the hands of these people that are making it happen. The leaders and the rank and file of the studio system became the owners of Gensler. So it's a good story, and they're still involved or are very actively involved in the field of architecture and as a model for other ESOPs. Next is Round Table Pizza, and it is the 11th largest pizza chain in the world, about 360 million in revenue. They had a publicly traded company, and then they went private using funding through a leveraged ESOP back in 1987. I know this one because I worked with the CFO of Roundtable when we were together at KPMG, and she went there and she went through the entire process. And over the years, I've learned how they did it, and it was a fascinating story. It was successful to accomplish the goal, which was to create some control for the owners or the managers of the business, and to provide liquidity for the former owners. The founder wanted to get some cash out. So unfortunately, they hit a competitive problem in 2011. The economy, we hit a recession, and they were out of position in terms of product, and they filed for bankruptcy. We'll talk more about that next class. They filed for bankruptcy, and they did a reorganization, came out of bankruptcy, and now they're on firm financial footing again. Now, sale to outside buyers has some characteristics. First is there's a control premium. So if they were to be just an investor, they're at the mercy, if you will, of the management and the board of directors. However, if they own the business, all that goes away. So they can do whatever they want with the company for financial reasons or strategic reasons for their own interests. And that is worth something, and that's typically called control premium. You see this in large public company sales as well, that the buyer wants control of that company for their own strategy. And there's the other idea of an illiquidity discount, where since you have an ownership of a private company, you can't liquefy that very easily. It's not like you could sell stock through your online broker. You must find somebody to buy it or sell it back to the company, and that's a tedious, if not impossible, task. So there's a discount when you buy private stock, and that's true for every private investment, because for all the people that hold that stock, it's very hard to get out.